Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade number 19. That is Symphony number 19 in D major. Now, listen to this. Do you know what that is? That, my friends, is a surprise. And Haydn is the greatest master of musical surprise. And Symphony number 19, which was not actually the 19th in order of composition, it was probably somewhere earlier. He wrote it between 1757 or 59 and 1761 when he was working for Count Morzin, that guy, before he even got to the Esterházys. So this is an early symphony. This is the first symphony where Haydn exploits the possibility of surprise. Now that particular surprise, here it is again. This particular surprise is nothing but a screech, a chord, a dissonant chord, which when you hear it in context is going to be even more surprising because it's an alien visitor in the environment into which it first appears. The music is just juggling along delightfully, and then all of a sudden you hear like that. That's what makes it surprising. But the element of surprise is a fascinating topic musically, and one of the wonderful things about these early Haydn symphonies, where he's beginning to work with the materials of music for the first time, is that we can hear the essential points with particular clarity. And this symphony is just a miracle in discussing the art of surprise. And so that's what I want to focus on for the most part in this talk. There are a couple other things that we'll listen to as well. Now, the first movement is a monothematic sonata form. And as I've said about a million times already, monothematic sonata form does not mean one theme. It means that the music is front-loaded, that there could be any number of little tunes and motives, but they all happen up front, and everything that comes later derives from them. So in this particular movement, you don't have to worry about first and second subjects. Worry about the surprise. You're going to hear a whole assortment of ideas that are tossed out right at the beginning. Different short ideas for the most part. For example, the rising, arpeggio with which the symphony begins, and then melodic bits as well. But all of that gets interrupted by the surprise. It comes and goes, and then it's gone. It also shows up in the development section, and it shows up in the recapitulation. And there are some mini surprises as well along the way that may resemble it, but you may not be quite sure. What Haydn wants you to do, of course, is remember the surprise. Now, here is the paradox about musical surprises. Sometimes they're surprising every time they show up. Sometimes they become less surprising as they go. And sometimes they can be used as binding material to actually unify a symphony. And that's a very interesting idea because something which is surprising is supposed to be unexpected and to that extent somewhat unique, but it can be used as a structural tool as well, which means something that's expected, something that binds things together. And it's that paradox that Haydn exploits in this symphony, this tiny little 12-minute symphony. It does everything with a surprise that you can want to do with a surprise, and it does it across movements, because after the first movement, which I'm going to play you complete, all the way through, we're going to hear the surprise pop up again in a very interesting context. So without further ado, I want you to listen to the first movement and just let it wash over you and listen for the surprises as they occur. And that is all you really need to know in listening to this movement. So let's do the whole first movement. This is, again, the Toronto Chamber Orchestra under Kevin Mallon, and it's a really fine performance, by the way, I have to say, on Naxos. Here you go. Listen to the first movement. Did you catch the surprises and the somewhat surprises and things that may have sounded like them? Because Haydn is so sensitive to all of the different contexts in which these things can appear and what happens to them. But the most fascinating thing about the idea of the surprise, and remember, there's a whole Haydn symphony called The Surprise, number 94. Haydn was the surprise guy. The thing that's so fascinating about these things is that they're not melodies, they're not tunes, they are gestures, they are objects. And, previous music was full of, surprising things, but mostly of a programmatic nature. That is, musical depiction of nature or birds or battles or storms. Those things can be surprising, but never until Haydn came along had the abstract idea of surprisingness be incorporated into the overall emotional or expressive trajectory of a piece of music. And this is the symphony where he does it for the very first time. Now, the second movement is in D minor. The whole symphony is what they call homotonal. That means it has one key. It's in D major or D minor. And that in itself is significant because the tonality binds the symphony together, but it also raises a question. And the question is the symphony really going to be in D major or in D minor? Is it going to be happy or is it going to be sad? The central andante is definitely of the sad variety. It's a movement of pensive is probably more the emotional quality, sort of disturbed and a little bit tense and full of disquiet. But when you listen to this symphony, you will hear the surprise. In fact, I'm going to play you the two surprises as you hear it in the first movement and as it will appear in the second movement. And then we will play some of the second movement, but there's another issue that I want you to think about in connection with the second movement. So first, let's listen to the two surprises, one right after the other with just a little pause between them. So there you go. It's obviously the same sort of idea, correct? But you have to hear it in context, within the context of the entire slow movement, and you'll see how it somehow sounds more part of the normal discourse of the movement. In fact, the surprise, in a sense, has found its home in this movement. What was rather disturbing and out of place in the first movement is more a part of the emotional climate of the second movement, and it sounds that way. It's still surprising. It still audibly relates to what we heard before, but it also has a different feel, a different context. But the other thing that I really want you to pay attention to before I play this excerpt is what happens in terms of the form of the movement, because this is a movement in beautiful two-subject textbook sonata form. It has a big development section and then a complete recapitulation. But there's something very interesting that happens with respect to the recapitulation, the repeat of the original themes of this movement. Because it's in D minor, all of the themes are going to be repeated in that key. In the exposition, you'll hear the tonal movement goes from minor to major. But in the recapitulation, it's going to stay in the minor. And because of that, Haydn does not need to repeat that opening theme to the same extent that he originally did, because it's not going anywhere. The motion music, the music that moves the music from one key to another, isn't necessary at all. And one of the aspects of that motion music was the surprise. And so you will not hear it in the recapitulation. The recapitulation is much shorter than the exposition as a result. And so for this extract, I'm going to play you the entire exposition, which you'll hear go from minor to major, and then I'm going to play you the recapitulation, which stays entirely in D minor, minus that surprise, which by now you have so stuck in your memory that you're going to go running around your house going, "Wah!" like that whenever you want to hear the surprise. So here, let's listen now to the andante, exposition, and a recapitulation. And I will leave you to figure out what happens in the development, because that's also very, very interesting in terms of combining both the first and second subjects into new ideas. It's marvelous what Haydn does with this stuff. Anyway, have a listen now. So there you have it, you see, a full exposition in 2 different keys with an abbreviated recapitulation. And that is going to become a very, very common practice, not because the music is in any way formulaic, but because the form itself demands a shorter recapitulation for the simple reason that you just don't need to hear everything so many times in the same key. And once it's been repeated that way, you know it. And so Haydn can get on with it and end the movement quite concisely. Now, the finale does not contain the surprise. And the reason it doesn't contain the surprise is because it's a finale. But the finale here has a different musical process to work out as the culmination of the entire symphony. Now, these finales in these early Haydn symphonies are usually these sort of rollicking, almost sort of sea shanty, folk-like things in quick tempos in short, what they call short meters. This is in 3/8. That is tiny note values. That means it's going to be quick. It's quick and peppy. It's only a 2.5 minutes or so complete. So if I play it without the repeats, which I will, it's only going to be about a minute and a few seconds for the entire movement. But so far, the symphony has been in either D major or D minor, with the last thing we heard, minor, being the winner in the symphonic discourse. But this is a happy symphony, and this is a happy finale. And so this symphony undoes what the previous movement did. In other words, it went from minor to minor again. Well, this finale is the mirror image. It's going from major to major for the happy conclusion. But there is, in the development section, a very lengthy, extended minor key episode, which tells us where we've been and reminds us that this symphony is about the contrast between D major and D minor, and it's only at the end where D major finally emerges triumphant. And that's what makes this finale such a satisfying outcome of the symphonic process that has been going on in the first 2 movements. So let's listen now to the finale. So there it is, a beautiful, adorable, marvelous little symphony in D major / D minor, ultimately D major, which tells us exactly where the music is going, and which exploits for the very first time in Haydn's career that amazing element of surprise that's going to feature in everything he does from here on in. It was part of his musical physiognomy, that's the word, from the very, very beginning, and it was something special really to Haydn. Nobody did it better. Nobody understood it better. Nobody understood the idea of musical materials that go beyond just having a tune, the tune. Of course, we get the tune, but there's so much more you can do with music if you use all of the other things beside the tune. It's like saying, an automobile is basically an engine and a frame with wheels. Yes, it is that, but you can have nice upholstery, you can have automatic steering, you can have air conditioning, you can have all of these wonderful things that power windows, who knows, a stereo system. You can have all of these other accoutrements that make the ride so much more enjoyable. And that was Haydn's great mastery, discovering as he composed each work new elements that make the journey so much more enjoyable. So keep on listening, folks. Thank you for joining me. Take care.